Evil couples often bring out the worst in one another, making their crimes much worse than they would otherwise be. Once they're found out, some scary people will turn, while others stay loyal until the end as they finally receive the punishment for their crimes. Number 5. 2 weeks after Lisa Bennett disappeared in 2013, her mother reported her missing to the police. More than a year later, it would be discovered that a creepy couple had befriended her and taken her life. Lisa had been dealing with dependency on alcohol and illegal substances, but was working to get herself clean. At some point, she met Kevin Flanagan and Kathleen Salmond, who allegedly had a similar lifestyle. They offered her a place to stay on their ground floor apartment, and Lisa was grateful for it. In May of 2013, Salmond had gone with Lisa to a pharmacy for Lisa to pick up a daily prescription. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but it was the last time Lisa would be seen. According to Flanagan, Lisa stole some meat from a shop while they were out. She told them she no longer wanted to live, and Flanagan and Salmond agreed to take her life. They cooked the meat that Lisa had stolen and told her that it was her last dinner. After they ate, they took Lisa's life in the bath and disposed of her body in a dumpster. Her body wasn't discovered before the trash was taken to a waste disposal site, and it's never been found. Flanagan and Salmond continued to claim Lisa's benefits. They had them directed into their own accounts and claimed that Lisa's boyfriend would visit once a week to collect it. The boyfriend was entirely fictional, though. They also sent text messages from Lisa's phone to her mother to give the impression that she was still alive, but Lisa's mother was still worried and contacted police. Flanagan's brother saw an appeal for information. Flanagan had told him the story about Lisa no longer wanting to live, and that there was nobody who would miss her. On seeing his brother had lied, he contacted police. Flanagan and Salmond were arrested and were later found guilty in court. Number 4. Skylar and his wife Jennifer DeLeon were responsible for a horrific true crime story that took the lives of a loving couple that just wanted to move back to Arizona to be with their grandchild. Tom and Jackie Hawks had worked hard all of their lives. It was fitting that when they retired, they bought a yacht called the Well-Deserved. After living in Arizona for most of their lives, they loved spending time on the open water. They spent a few years living on the Well-Deserved before their first grandchild was born. Both Tom and Jackie loved their grandchild and decided to sell the yacht and move back to be close to their family again. It was then that they met the DeLeons. Skylar DeLeon had turned to a life of crime to try to support himself, his family, and his wife's ambitions of a fairy tale life. It was primarily burglary, which had already landed him a stint in jail. But when they saw the ad for the Well-Deserved, the evil couple came up with an even more heinous plan. Despite the fact they couldn't even afford to move out of Jennifer's parents' garage, Skylar went to meet the Hawks about buying the boat. When Tom was skeptical about whether or not DeLeon would be able to afford it, he called Jennifer and told her to bring their toddler daughter to the harbor. He managed to convince his victims he was a family man, and they agreed to take DeLeon and the other 2 men out for a test drive of the boat. It was while they were out on the open water that DeLeon committed his horrific act. He and his accomplices overpowered the couple, tied them up, and forced them to sign over documents giving DeLeon the boat and the rights to their money. They were then tied to an anchor and dropped into the ocean. It was a few days later that Tom and Jackie's family realized that they were missing. Tom had already told them the DeLeons were looking to buy the boat, so the family was able to point police in the right direction when they reported the couple as missing. DeLeon claimed he had bought the boat in cash. When asked where the money was from, he claimed it was from money laundering. Having just confessed to a crime, police figured he was probably telling the truth. But when they looked at the crime closer and noticed one of the anchors from the yacht was missing, they realized that this wasn't the case. DeLeon was arrested, first for the crime he had confessed to in order to stop him leaving the country. But when it was discovered he had dropped the Hawks' car in Mexico and tried to take money from their bank account, he was arrested for taking their lives. At first, Jennifer De Leon was thought to be innocent. She hadn't been on the boat and would claim she didn't know about the crime until after it had taken place. But her husband painted a different story. He called her at every stage of the crime to make sure he was doing what she wanted, and according to him, she was the one who had come up with the idea in the first place. They were both found guilty of taking the lives of Tommy and Jackie Hawks for money. Skylar De Leon was also found guilty of taking the life of another man who he had convinced to hand over money for a business venture before taking his life shortly before the well-deserved plot. Number 3. Human history is littered with rulers who have a claim for the title of the most evil person in history. But much rarer is for it to be a couple to share power and earn that title. For lots of people living in Romania in the later half of the 21st century, Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Elena could be considered one of the most evil couples on the planet. Ceausescu came to power after the passing of his predecessor in 1965. Romania was part of the Eastern Bloc and one of the Soviet Union's satellite states. Though Ceausescu would often go against Moscow, earning praise from politicians in the West, back home, his rule oversaw Romanian citizens living in the worst conditions of the Eastern Bloc, all while he and his wife lived a life of luxury. Reading about Romania's communist rule, it's easy to draw parallels to revolutionary France before King Louis XVI was deposed. But Ceausescu and his wife had much more responsibility in how bad their citizens' lives had become. In 1981, Ceausescu implemented an austerity program, which meant there was not enough to eat. Romania had built a large debt, in part due to how much it was buying from outside the country. In this new program, food was sold abroad to try to bring that debt down, and basics were rationed for the people of Romania. Clothing and food were also rationed, and electricity and heating were cut off. Disease was also commonplace. Ceausescu didn't only refuse to help the situation, but he actively made it worse when he did things like insisting that HIV was actually a Western lie, and denied how it was transmitted. Secret police walked the streets with hundreds of thousands of informants, causing people to live in fear. They were allegedly the largest and most feared of the Eastern Bloc, and people who opposed Ceausescu and his rule disappeared. While this was happening, a new luxurious palace was being built for the man who called himself Conductor. It was an extravagant building that spared no expense, and people who had been living on the land where it was built were evicted. Resentment boiled over, and when the Soviet Union began to collapse, Romania was the site of the only violent revolution. As was the case in 18th century France, the couple that had lived like king and queen were the most famous casualties. But comparing Elena Ceausescu to Marie Antoinette doesn't do justice to how much influence she had. She was a powerful member of the government, working in various ministries before becoming the first deputy prime minister. She was described as vindictive and devious, and is known to have fraudulently acquired scientific degrees and PhDs, which are still recognized in many places outside of Romania. Both of the Ceausescus thought they were untouchable, and when protests on the street threatened their lives, they sent out leaflets telling starving people to go home and enjoy a Christmas feast. They were eventually captured, had a trial, and their lives were ended on Christmas Day of 1989. Number 2. Edward Kearney and Avril Jones not only took the life of a vulnerable young woman they were supposed to be caring for, but they managed to keep their crime a secret for 15 years. From 1999 to 2016, it was almost as if everyone had forgotten Margaret Fleming existed. The only record that she was still alive was that her carers were still getting benefit payments from the government. Margaret had gone to live with Kearney and Jones about 2 years before she vanished. She had a learning disability and was considered vulnerable. For most of her teenage years, she had lived with her father and felt somewhat abandoned by her mother. When her father passed away and she went to live with her mother struggled to cope with Margaret's behavioral problems, and Kearney and Jones stepped in. Margaret told her mother she wanted to live with them. When her mother received a letter saying Margaret no longer wanted to see her, she left Margaret alone. At the time, nobody realized it, but Margaret was then kept in horrid conditions in a chaotic and squalor-filled home. It's believed at first Margaret really had wanted to stay there, but then later Kearney and Jones didn't give her a choice. The last time she was seen by anybody, other than the 2 people who were supposed to care for her, was December 17, 1999. She was 19 years old and joined the couple when they went to Jones's brother's home. She wasn't present for Christmas dinner the following week. It's believed Kearney and Jones took Margaret's life sometime between December 17th and early January of 2000. It was in January that they started to receive letters. The letters were allegedly from Margaret and were sent from Carlisle and later London. However, people who had taught Margaret claimed that the letters were too well written for her, as she'd only had a reading age of 8. It would also later be discovered that Kearney and Jones had been staying at the same hotel one of the letters supposedly came from on the date that it was written. But nobody noticed this at first. It wasn't until 2012 that anyone came forward looking for Margaret. A benefits investigator went to the couple's home to speak to Margaret, but was told that she couldn't see her. Given the state of the house, the investigator asked for a social worker to run a welfare check, but none took place. In 2016, Jones filed an application for personal independence payments on Margaret's behalf. She claimed Margaret needed constant care, and they needed additional money for that. When police went to the house to see Margaret, there was no sign of her. At first, the couple claimed Margaret had run off with travelers in December of 1999, pointing to the letters as evidence. As the couple were hoarders, police were able to find an invoice from the hotel in London, uncovering their lies. They later claimed she was a criminal gangmaster in Europe and sold and bought illegal substances. This was a far cry from a woman who the couple claimed they had to stop from eating out of a dog bowl and needing constant care. Margaret's body was never found, and the couple have refused to say what they've done with her, but they were both found guilty of taking her life and sent to prison. Number 1. Antoinette Martinez figured she and her boyfriend, Cameo Clines, were a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, but they wouldn't get away with their string of crimes for very long, and the evil couple were brought to justice after taking the lives of 2 people. Martinez and Clines were motivated by money. They both worked at a fast food restaurant that Martinez managed, but weren't making much money. They figured the best way to increase their earnings was through illegal means. It started with simple theft from the restaurant, but then progressed to armed robbery. Their first victim was one of Martinez's ex-boyfriends. Xavier Cordero Jr. was the son of a police detective who had dated Martinez in the past. She lured Xavier to her home with the promise of having relations with him. He arrived in the early hours of June 18, 2014, but when he went into the bedroom, he found Clines pointing a weapon at him. Clines attacked Xavier, and he and his girlfriend used packing tape to bind him. They used Xavier's car to drive him to a remote location. It was only then that Clines took Xavier's life. They took between $125 and $250 from his body and fled in his car. The money didn't last very long, and they soon began searching for another victim. Martinez set up a dating profile on Meet Me, where she contacted Stephen Rendon. Like with Xavier, Stephen was lured to Martinez's home. She bound him with the packing tape before Clines entered the bedroom with the weapon. Again, they took their victim to a remote location before taking his life with the same weapon used against Xavier. This time though, Stephen had less than $5 on his person. It didn't take long for police to connect the two crimes. No effort was made to hide the bodies, and it was clear the same weapon had been used. At first, police thought that only one person was behind the two crimes, but then the criminals gave themselves away. Clines held up a convenience store, leaving the clerk with a serious wound that he managed to survive. This time, police were able to trace the culprit to Clines' apartment, where they also found Martinez. A search of the home turned up not only the weapon used in the three crimes, but also Steven's car, and his and Xavier's driver's licenses, which had been hidden in the toilet bowl tank. Police also found the packing tape used to bind the two victims. Martinez tried to point the blame at Clines and said that he had framed her for any involvement. He said she had encouraged him but pleaded guilty and was handed 2 life sentences. Martinez was also found guilty, and the other half of this evil couple found herself behind bars. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.